Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. I'll just do the required moment of letting all of the Zooms connect and join. Hello. Okay. Good evening. Wonderful to be here with you all. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in tonight from Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country and that sovereignty was never ceded. I think it's really important in any discussion about democracy to recognise that this is stolen land and that there was never a treaty in place, and that we won't see a fair democracy in this country without a proper treaty, truth-telling and good representation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So welcome to tonight's webinar on state capture and the new book, Sleek, Australia's Toxic Relationship with Big Oil. My name's Isabella and I'm the Engagement Coordinator at the Australian Democracy Network, or ADN. As well as our special guests, we have my colleague Nina on the call, who's helping with tech and chat. So if you need help or if you need anything tonight, please do ping her in the chat. I'd encourage you to use the chat a lot. Please introduce yourself now, let us know where you're calling in from, and also use it throughout the evening to engage in the Q&A. Please put your questions in there as they come up, and you can use the emoji reacts to like people's questions. That will help us make sure that the most questions get asked in the best amount of time. And if you need closed captions tonight, they're available as well. You can navigate to the bottom of the Zoom screen and press the CC and turn them on. So I know that a lot of you are new to the Australian Democracy Network, which is amazing. Hello. We are a national organisation working to create a healthy Australian democracy that puts people and the planet first. We work on campaigns to strengthen civil society, protect the right to protest, and to get big money out of politics. And at ADN, we're committed to a democracy where the best interests of people and the planet come first, not the best interests of private industry. And one thing that we consider a major threat to this vision is the practice of state capture. If you haven't heard this expression before, or at least before RSVPing, because it's the name of the event, it describes a system of political influence where private interests have significant power over government decision-making. And state capture shows up in different ways, different processes. These include financial interventions like donations to politicians, lobbying and personal influence, the revolving door between business and industry, and others. But really, it's a systemic process that involves lots of practices. And we wrote a report on state capture in 2022. If you're interested in exploring the concept a little more later on, Nina will pop a link in the chat for that report for you. So one industry that's very familiar with the practices I just described is the fossil fuels industry. I'm sure you're all well aware of the overwhelming influence they've had over Australian politics in the last 2 decades. And unfortunately, despite the Labor government's insistence otherwise, it seems to me like the climate wars are not over. And we know that the fossil fuel industry has been a major instigator in that debate. I think for me, it's one thing to have a sense of this power and influence, and it's long kind of felt like this overshadow for me in when I think about politics in this country. But understanding how it operates and where it's come from is much harder. And I think it's really important for us to be able to understand that and point to examples so that we can grapple with how to respond and so that we can build our collective work to make our democracy fairer. And so for these reasons, and also because I'm a big nerd, I was so excited to hear about Royce Kurmelovs' new book, Sleek. Sleek takes a comprehensive look at the origins of the Australian petroleum industry, investigating what these companies knew about climate change and how they learned to wield influence and insert themselves into all facets of public life. It's a case study in the practices of state capture. And it's why we're here tonight. So I'm so excited to be welcoming Royce to speak about his work. Royce Kurmelovs is a freelance reporter and author covering the intersection of class, finance, and climate change. He's the author of 5 books whose reporting has appeared in Rolling Stone, Science, The Guardian, The Saturday Paper, The Monthly, BBC, Al Jazeera English, and other publications. And amazingly, we have 2 investigative journalists with us tonight. The 2 both share a commitment to public interest reporting and to exploring the power of the fossil fuel industry. I'm also excited to welcome Lyndal Rowlands, who's a journalist and audio documentary maker. Lyndal has reported for Al Jazeera English, ABC RN, Audible Originals, The Saturday Paper, The Guardian, and the investigative climate change podcast Drilled. She was previously a UN correspondent in New York for the Interpress service. And I want to give a special shout out to Lyndal, who actually is in New York at the moment. So it's very early in the morning there, and we're so grateful to have you with us. In just a moment, I'll hand over to them, and they're going to be running the show tonight. Lyndal will be interviewing Royce about his work, state capture, and the oil and gas industry in Australia. We're also going to have lots of time for your questions. Please pop them in the chat as they come up. If you're just joining us, this is how we're going to manage the Q&A. It'll help us get through more questions if we have them on the speaking list early. So yeah, get in that chat. Nina and I will be making sure that your questions get in the queue. And I'm just really looking forward to this discussion. So thank you both so much for being here, and to all of you for being here. And Lyndal, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I can see that we have about 80 participants joining us so far. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing all of your questions. I'm joining, yes, as Isabella said, I'm joining from the lands of the Lenape people in New York. And yes, I'm seeing some people putting in where they're joining us from. Please keep doing that. And as we get started with this discussion, please just be thinking about your questions, popping them in the chat, interacting with each other in the chat, letting us know which questions you're dying to hear the answers to. I am so excited to talk with Royce tonight about this incredible book, Slick. I was so fortunate to, well, Royce and I are both journalists, so fortunate that we've been able to connect over this book, and was, I think, there chatting with him towards the end of the very long process of sorting through all of the dusty archives and going to fossil fuel industry conferences and chatting through some of the, I guess, some of the difficult questions around how to write a book like this and make it you know, engaging and fun and yeah, tackle some of these really big questions that we have in light of what's happening to our beautiful country that we all care about very much. So Royce, I guess my first question for you is, thinking about what are the goals of fossil fuel public relations strategies or disinformation or whatever we want to call them, because one of those goals, I think, has been actually to try to make it all seem like it's just too hard to talk about climate change. It's too messy, it's too confusing, it's too dominated by disagreement and arguments, and that maybe it's just easier to just forget about it all and put it off for another 5, 10, 15, 50 years, and we'll work that all out later. So when you were researching this book and writing it, how did you keep yourself grounded? You know, I think one of the really beautiful things that you do is you actually remind us about those things that we all love about nature and this beautiful country, Australia, for example, describing, you know, the beauty of the Great Barrier Reef. So what were the things that, you know, brought you back to, like, how did you manage to wade through all of that sort of public relations strategy, but also remind yourself of why you wanted to write this book, and what were the things that kept you grounded?
Well, thank you. And it's a great question and a very good one, I think. I also have to acknowledge that I'm phoning in tonight from Bundjalung country in the Northern Rivers area. And I wrote the book and kind of come by way of Ghana country in Adelaide. So hello to all the people in there from chat. I think it's just how I kept myself grounded. I think it was very challenging. From the moment I started researching this, attempting to move into these spaces and talk to these people and trying to pass all this information that's, you know, and all these kind of talking points and everything that's going on, and to make sense of the situation in order to be able to communicate it publicly, was frankly a challenge. The point about, I think early on in the book, for instance, I write that the point with a lot of these communication strategies is just to repeat the same line ad nauseum until it becomes almost accepted as common knowledge. And it was often hard to step away from that. It was hard to get outside that world and that echo chamber for a little bit and to kind of get into my own world. And sometimes it was quite frankly overwhelming, as well as kind of having to sit through multiple speeches, talks, events, conferences. I was also, as mentioned, I was pouring through these kind of old records where I was reading the materials that these people have been putting together over, 20, 30, 40 years. And so on the one hand, there was, the field research, which you described, where I'm describing these kind of beautiful features of our landscape, the Great Barrier Reef, what it was like to kind of stomp around the proposed Narrabri gas sites, and other places as part of this kind of, almost world building of this of this work. But the other was also when you find yourself working from industry documents to understand and trying to piece together what happened, you find that these documents are quite honest. People are almost audacious in their, or it's audacious in their honesty, and the level of cut through that provides offers some real clarity, to the talking points of today. Because where one person today might describe gas as a transition fuel, you find these debates being hashed out on the floor of these, big, in front of these big national conferences at the heart of the oil industry, where they're describing LNG as not a clean fuel and not being in all caps. And so it's those little moments that you kind of grasp onto. It's the ability to recognize the interaction between that rhetoric and the physical world, and like the place and location in which you're researching, talking to people, and understanding the consequences of this problem. And I think finally as well, which kind of, I'm not sure if you want to touch on this, but like the other thing that keeps you grounded is a real recognition that the costs of inaction, the costs of failing to do something on climate change, are human, are real, are tangible. And for that, I illustrate that right at the start with the story of Kate Stroud, who survived the Lismore flood. And I did that specifically so that everyone reading this understands exactly what's at stake here, exactly what the terms of the conversation are, and there can be no confusion in the matter.
Yeah. I mean, that part about what happened in the floods in the Northern Rivers, it's just, beautiful. The floating cow is, you have some really interesting sort of little anecdotes in there. But, you mentioned, that it's kind of overwhelming. I mean, shout out to archives and archivists, because maybe it's a sort of one of those little underrated aspects of democracy, and is, access to information, and maybe something that we don't think about is typically, when we think about what is democracy. Of course, democracy, the one thing that we often think about is just, great, we have a great electoral system in Australia, we have fancy little pencils, we have sausage sizzles, but what is democracy? And I think that's one of the great things that the Australian Democracy Network is doing, is reminding us that democracy is so much more than voting once every 3 years or so. I guess this concept of state capture, so coming back to the theme of tonight's event, and also something that is actually quite prominent in your framing of the book that you bring in quite early, this concept of state capture, you use that to describe how the major parties are just so present at this industry conference in 2022, and I don't really need to remind people why that year is significant, as you really lay out in your writing about what had happened in the years leading up to 2022. But you look at many different aspects of democracy, from the revolving door between politicians and industry, the protest rights and that sort of thing. But I guess one aspect of democracy that I'm really interested in, and you're probably really interested in, and in light of this book that we're talking about tonight, is the role of journalism. And so I guess we've possibly had some prominent stories related to journalism and freedom of the press in Australia recently. But I guess my question to you, because that was quite a long-winded intro to my question, but how do you feel like? Do you feel like Australian journalism is equipped to deal with like the sheer scale of the information? You know, even if it's just the same information being repeated over and over again by the fossil fuel industry, do you feel that journalism in Australia is equipped to deal with that sheer scale of information put out by the fossil fuel industry?
Well, and that's also a really important question, but I want to go back to something you said earlier as well, which is the importance of this kind of historical memory to our democracy. And that's something you find, like what I found is that, you know, in researching this, there was a deliberate effort by industry to essentially buy that institutional knowledge from government departments and shift it into private hands. And that effectively meant that every interaction between industry and government became an ambush. And so when you talk about the importance of those archives, I mean, for one, who knew that going to the library can help you solve mysteries? You know, that was a big revelation on my part. But you know, but that ability to store those records, particularly where industry and government react, are vital to being able to hold power into account. So you're right to point to that as a function of our democracy. And then that also plays into the role of media in this. You know, we understand the role of reporters, of journalists, you know, in the kind of noble vision of this, to be acting in a public interest, not business interest, not in the interest of government, but in the public, and to pursue that line as far as it will take, and even where it conflicts occasionally with the state interest or with the business interest. And I think the story of, you know, climate change and the role of the oil and gas industry in Australia is central to that quest. Essentially, you've got a relationship between industry and government that goes back half a century, if not more. And in, you know, and I can provide the context for this, but it's a little bit boring for the people, you know, kind of listening. But but as a subset to this, not only were industry looking to become really good friends with those who were making decisions about their future, because they wanted to get really, really rich, and they wanted the government to make it as easy as possible for them to do so. But they were they were also explicitly targeting reporters the whole way down. You know, there was an institution known as the Petroleum Information Bureau that was set up, I think, in 1952. This was essentially a marketing and public relations arm of the industry, which was designed to churn out pamphlets, documents, newspaper articles, and push things out, you know, to the world to try and get people on board with the idea of a massive expansion of the oil industry at that time. And to do that, they hired ex-journalists to write these publications, to write these books, to write these periodicals, and so even with there, you see the strategy, you know, by industry to, you know, like, get in with the media, because they understood the power of communication, they understood the power of reporters, they understood about, you know, there's the value of recruiting reporters to be able to advance their interest. And you even see this with the discovery. My favorite fact, I've been working on an investigation since the book that I'm hoping will drop soon, and this will be revealed in it, so this is a bit of a teaser. But I mean, you had, you know, figures like William Walkley, the guy who was responsible for the first oil find in Australia. You know, he was on a personal first name basis with many members of the financial press during the early 50s. And he, you know, and it's pretty clear that he was going around, you know, encouraging them to buy shares in Ampol, and then giving them kind of the wink and nudge about whenever something was going to happen, because that meant that there was a shared interest, which then boosted the news interest in the oil industry, contributing to these wild swings in mood and these huge headlines that actually freaked out the American companies we relied upon. So when we talk about the importance of, you know, journalistic democracy, I mean, it's fundamental, and industry have known that for a long time, which is why they've, you know, set up to essentially buy and co-opt those same, and, you know, they set up to buy and co-opt the press.
Yeah, and you know, it sounds like you were sort of almost describing, you know, there's even a revolving door within journalism and industry there as well. And I think people are familiar with the name Walkley. Maybe journalists are familiar. I don't know if other people outside our industry are familiar, but you know,
This guy founded
certainly,
the industry awards, which are equivalent to the Pulitzer
yeah,
for those.
that you're definitely going to get for this book now. That thank you to you know, to journalists and to and you know, climate change activists who have actually, you know, worked with the Walkley Awards to address concerns about fossil fuel funding, and it looks like those concerns have finally been addressed. So looking forward to seeing how this goes in this year's Walkley Awards if you're entering, Royce. As Sonia was saying, you know, here in Western Australia, and you do have some case studies from Western Australia. It's a unique state, but Sonia is saying here in Western Australia, the media is in a love triangle with politicians and Woodside. So there you go. And you know, there is some pretty unique history in Australia being home to News Corp. But I was quite fascinated to see that you wrote that there was actually a front page article in the Australian in 1983 on climate change, but perhaps things may have changed a bit after that.
Yeah, well, and that's also a really interesting thing. So, like, and to go back to the Western Australian point, I mean, the significance of Western Australia in this story is like critical, because Western Australia was the first state where oil was found. It was where the industry was born. From the beginning, these companies were looking to, encourage a close relationship with members of the state government to ensure those developments can go ahead without any risk, essentially. And then when you've got, in terms of the media environment, I mean, you've got companies there that are also very close to the resources sector and owned by people with interests in the resources sector, and so it creates a very closely aligned relationship that results in that compromises the ability to get this information out there. But what's incredible, though, is when you start looking through the history of climate change, you start to see around the same time, so it's as you'll read in the book, I mean, industry were well aware of the pending issues around climate change early on. The US oil industry was actively engaging in research into this, and not just theorizing, but actually looking at hard data. But then at the same time, this information began to kind of leak out, or at least spread around civil society groups who started to raise awareness. Many in the audience will remember Soylent Green as being, I think, the critical film in 1973, which is the first film to depict a climate-shocked future. But then also you had newspapers like The Australian reporting on this stuff. And and every now and then one of these stories would crop up in a piece to remind everyone that this is an ongoing issue, but it was never embraced as something that was pressing, time-consuming, critical, or something that needed to be acted upon now. And that kind of casual interest in the story changes again. So when you get more towards the late 1980s, when you have this real disinformation campaign kind of kick off around the science of climate change, suddenly you start to see these kind of people who are represented as experts, talking to these stories and introducing kind of fear and uncertainty and doubt about the science of this stuff. And their job is in a manner of speaking, to send up chaff. It's not meant to be kind of, stand up. It's just meant to kind of provide interference that confuses people watching. And then so people, like you say, Lyndal, at the start, throw up their hands and go, it's all too hard. And then we wind up, kind of where we are today, in fact.
Yeah, that is one and possibly one of the quite central strategies of the public relations strategies that we see coming out of the oil, gas, and coal industries. I have a couple more questions for you, but then I'm really looking forward to also hearing some questions from the audience. I'm seeing people are putting their questions into the chat, and that's where we'll be selecting the questions from. So keep asking those questions there. Feel free to interact with each other in the chat as well. I guess, see if I can squeeze in two more questions though, Royce. I guess one of them is just coming back to, I guess as a journalist, I found that there can be something almost sort of freeing about turning that lens back on the fossil fuel industry. We've both been really fortunate to work with the US-based American investigative journalist Amy Westervelt on her podcast Drilled, and one of the things that Amy does is she looks at actually how this history actually of sort of fossil fuel public relations strategies does actually go back over 100 years. But also that podcast, I think, gained some popularity because it was using probably one of the most popular formats for podcasts, which was a true crime format. So what's it like sort of turning a lens back on the industry? I mean, we see early on that you did get that one email that was sort of discouraging you from looking into this. I don't know if that was a little bit surprising to receive that, if that made you think twice, because I guess that was part of the purpose. But I guess, as journalists, one of our roles is really to use the active voice, to look at who is actually responsible. What's it been like sort of, do you think that sometimes like climate change reporting in Australia might sort of I mean, we have an issue in Australia where we'll talk about major environmental disasters and not even sort of reference climate change. But then when we do reference climate change, we may not reference who's sort of responsible for causing it. Did it feel kind of freeing in some ways to turn that lens back on the fossil fuel industry for you?
Absolutely. Well, there's two parts to that. I'll take the second one first, 'cause I think that was the interesting observation. So, I think, I mean, with some notable exceptions, there are some excellent people doing climate reporting in Australia. Like, for like the Guardian have a climate team, Michael Slezak at the ABC, yourself, like the Saturday paper of talking about, covering this increasingly. But I think on the whole, there is a lot of editorial disinterest in the idea of climate change for two reasons, which is partly to do with the toxic kind of debate that happened over the last 20 years, the toxic politics around this, and also a kind of misinformed sense that climate change is all, X emissions by this year, or like facts and figures and statistics. And you mentioned Amy Westervelt at the start. She famously used a true crime lens to examine this issue, and I think it was incredibly powerful and revelatory for a lot of people, because it not only showed people how this happened, but who was responsible. And so in that way, it became a channel for anger and frustration. And so all that confusion that you had suddenly was clarified, because you got to see the mechanics of it. It's like looking under the hood of a car and examining the engine. Suddenly you saw how it all fits together. And I absolutely took inspiration from Amy, and as she says, every story is now a climate story. And when you start thinking about the world that way, when you start thinking about the issue that way, suddenly the story gets more powerful and alive, and and engaging. And there's characters and drama and all the things that require from storytelling. But also, it actually makes it more accessible to people who care about this, and also clarifies those power dynamics, those critical relationships, that those issues of state capture, which were described up top. We see how it came to be, and once you see how it comes to be, you can then unmake it. And so, to go back to the idea of like, what was it like to turn the lens on the fossil fuel industry? It's been said in the past in Australia that whenever Australia talks about climate change, it tends to understand the issue through the lens of its fossil fuel exports. One of my goals throughout this was to invert that, to understand Australia's fossil fuel exports through the context of climate change. And so when you start to do that, what comes together is, and I think for me, one of the most powerful and like both awful and important insights was the extent to which our present moment rests atop a series of decisions that were made by powerful people over successive decades, before many of us were even around. And we are living in the world they created. But as I said, once you know that, once you see how it was made, then it becomes possible, for policymakers and activists and the people who do this to then go and apply themselves in ways that then unmake this and remake this in a different, better way, and actually address these problems. Because it provides the information, it provides the guidance, and also, weirdly enough, you can learn from these guys. It's what like it's when you see how they did it, you can see like that there is insight there, even if it's coming from a bad place, and that can be applied to future things.
And thank you. I think that's always really important to highlight, if we're being critical of our own industry of journalism, that it's not a monolith, and that there are actually people doing incredible work, and with few resources, and even yourself, researching this book. I am going to get to audience questions in one moment, but I did want to say, another really important aspect of state capture and the work of the Australian Democracy Network is, looking at, for example, looking at, how in Australia, what's happening to activists in terms of clamping down on that right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and engagement with our democracy is really under threat, and that actually the fossil fuel industry is quite central to that. But one of the things that I think that messaging is about is shifting the focus away from what people are actually talking about with their activism, and bringing it back to sort of, these activists, they're not perfect, or even, they're criminal. Rather than, who are the you know, when we talk about a true crime format, we're potentially, you know, we're talking about you know, who are the real criminals, and why they're trying to shift that focus. But I just guess one last thing I wanted to highlight is that in the book you have some interesting examples, you know, across the decades about how people actually did come together through activism, through some interesting kinds of coalitions, often Indigenous-led resistance, and that fossil fuel projects that were particularly problematic were prevented or at least delayed. In the case of the Great Barrier Reef, it was sort of interesting, you know, perhaps more delayed because of the effects of climate change coming along later. But yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, that also brings us to the questions that we're going to receive from everyone. So I don't know if that's more of a comment, but just saying that, you know, that, like, did you see that maybe the industry is actually a little bit afraid of activism, because in some cases it actually does work when people come together?
Well, I think there's so much to this. I think for a start, when you read the book, you will notice that a lot of the stories of people engaging in activism in some form, people who live through, you know, like climate change induced natural disasters, people who are, you know, young in kind of our age bracket because they feel like they have no other choice and they've tried all, you know, what is considered to be the legitimate form of political engagement, and it has resolved nothing. And also people who formerly, like there was one story, for instance, where someone who formerly used to work with a company and then decided that it was enough and then quit and then left, you know, and walked away from this because they understood the dynamics of what was going on. So what I see is, and what I see is, as someone who has written about social movements in the past and the importance, I see people reaching for whatever tools that they have, and using them to address this problem in any way that they can. And yeah, for instance, I mean, another example of this is the sponsorship stuff. So in the book, I quote some figures that were generated by Penny Tangi, who's a children's author. She just kind of on her own started cataloging, the scope and scale of all these sponsorship arrangements. And then once you start to know these things, then that allows people within, you know, say nippers programs or sports clubs to start agitating and asking to end fossil fuel sponsorship of their particular club or art or, you know, organization. So you see these forms of resistance across the board. And you mentioned, for instance, Indigenous resistance. And I think another really critical important to make from this is that the confrontations between Indigenous communities and oil companies came first. When you look at how, because when you look at how these the industry reacted to and mobilized around kind of political issues, one of the first, earliest existential threats for the industry was Indigenous land rights. They were actively involved in monitoring this, in tracking it and lobbying over this in order to maintain an equilibrium. And when the Marber decision came down, that undermined the basis of that undermined the basis of kind of that status quo that had been achieved. It overturned everything. It was a moment where the industry realized the limits of their influence, and then, you know, kind of came together and basically looked at climate change and saw that as the next issue coming, and we're like, right, well, we're not going to let that happen again with that issue, because that's also far more existential for us at this time. And so then, you know, and the importance of understanding this is first off that the industry itself were activists, were organized, were engaged, focused around a goal. And then now what you're seeing is a pushback from these campaigns. And that's where the individuals know about this kind of resistance. I would say yes, even just from a purely business level, when you go to a event, one of the things you do is matrix of all the things that go into whether or not, you know, this is going to work out. And one of the factors in that risk matrix is communication. You know, how much do people not like you or don't around? And if that becomes a real economic material risk that you have to factor in, it's worth going ahead with this. And it's worth mentioning as well that there are hundreds of protests going on all the time about this.
A little bit with my lab. If people, it would be great to have you have the people who've sort of submitted their questions come off mute. We have one here from, I think I'm saying, is this Cherie? Cherie, would you like to come off mute and ask your question? Because it's looking at, the book does, focus particularly on big oils. So Cherie has a question about that. Does anyone found?
I'm here. Can you hear
hello.
me?
Hi.
Hi. Thanks, Royce. Great book. I was wondering why you focused on the oil industry rather than coal and gas, and how you see them fitting together. And at some point, this is a sneaky second question, Atlas Network. Can we talk about Atlas Network, please?
So first off, I conceptualized the book as focusing on oil and gas, or petroleum, and I did that in a kind of, I lumped them together because much of the focus in this country has consistently been on coal producers, and that was kind of the fight that took place the last decade. And when you look at the way in which oil and gas is operated, I personally believe like there has been a lack of focus on the historical activities and attitudes around climate change. And I think it's also important to remember the relationship between the two. So the oil producers are also gas producers. Originally, they were looking for oil, but they kept finding gas and were kind of annoyed about it because they really wanted the oil. But then they started to develop the gas to basically to sustain themselves because there wasn't enough oil here. So where I use oil, I'm referring to kind of oil and gas across the board, or petroleum across the board. It's just, and I did that just because it's easier to communicate. In terms of the Atlas Network, that's a really good question, and really important. So for instance, I spent a chapter in the book describing the creation of a system of think tanks that were used to kind of essentially generate this information, and the development of what came to be known as the Atlas Network. If people are not familiar with it, you can then go, you can read the book, but also you can check out Dr. Jeremy Walker's work, who was actively researching this. And what was fascinating about this is that I credit him for finding this. He found this incredible letter from John Bonithan, who was one of the founders of Santos, where he, in a letter to his counterpart in Texas, he was attempting to communicate with this guy and tell him what was up. He basically laid out pretty much the reason for these things existing, and that is to promote the that is to promote the interest of businessmen who would otherwise be ignored. And he was in direct contact with the guy who ultimately helped create the Atlas Network, who forged this, who use them together. I'm not going to go into the formation of that, but I think, but the legacy of this we see today, because it continues to exist in some form, and it's essentially a public relations house for the ideas that are favorable to business, and knowing about it is the first step to kind of inoculating against these sorts of ideas. Sorry, I was a bit long-winded.
No. That's great. And but I'm just going to jump right into our next question, which is from Kath. Have we got Kath there? So Kath is asking about how we can address state capture.
Yeah, sorry, I've just unmuted.
Hello. Hi,
Hello.
Kath.
I have to admit, I haven't read the report. I haven't read the book. I'm fairly new to this. I'm an engineer and I want solutions. I want actions. I'm a problem solver, and I'm just really trying to understand what are the driving forces that can be changed to somehow deal with this, because it's a big, I'm just learning about it. It does my head in. So what are the systemic changes that can possibly be made from the research that you guys have done? You're seeing the trends, you're seeing the causes, you're seeing the impact. But what do we do about it? And don't just tell me to vote for the right people, because that is not the answer. That is too simple in my mind. And I'm learning that as humans, the only tools us citizens have is our vote, our voice, our dollars and our time, the tools of activism. But there's got to be more than that. Somehow the system has to change. We've got to change the rules and the laws that actually get the outcome that you need. You can't blame the people. You can't rely on people to do everything. So that's just my question. Thank you.
Well, it's a big question.
Kath, and yeah, great to hear from you being engaged. Sorry, Royce.
Well, look, I also need to be clear. I also need to be clear up front as well, is that I'm a journalist and reporter. I am not an activist. I'm not a lawmaker. So I don't get to write the rules. My job is to find things. So I find the information that then other people can then go and use and put to work in service to whatever that they're doing. What I will say is, based on the people I have been writing about, the people I have been covering and reporting on and looking at, I think that if you want to change it, I think the first thing is that I already see change happening. I already like it. It seems bleak. It seems, in some cases, sometimes it's a long shot, and there's a lot going on all at once, and it's very overwhelming. But I already see change underway. I see the very presence of these kind of activist groups who are very focused on these issues and who are out there raising hell as contributing towards the changing the social conditions required to make that change possible. I already see it becoming increasingly untenable for decision makers and lawmakers to either fudge it or to refuse to have a position. You know, you've already seen the current Albanese government, for instance, have done things like pass a safeguard mechanism, but they're also wavering on a whole suite of other reforms and proposals. And you're already seeing them losing public opinion, public support. You're seeing independents, you're seeing, you know, obviously the Teals are one, you're seeing the Greens pick up more of a vote. You're seeing, and as I said, you're seeing, you know, people in the space of their particular like social clubs, their arts groups, their you know, their sports clubs, ending that fossil fuel sponsorship, you know, which is small but a tangible, meaningful result, and that adds up to something. And I will say, you know, I cannot say who, I cannot say how, but you know, I'm aware that once a major oil and gas executive in this country was overheard in a airport lounge complaining that no one will take their money anymore. You know, so you know, I wouldn't disclose those sources. I also think, by the way, that it is very significant that you're seeing a lot of this pushback originate within Western Australia. You're seeing, you know, the emergence of these activist groups in the heart, in the place in the country where the most organized element of the industry exists, where the headquarters of these operations are located, where much of this work goes on. You're seeing people dare to push back, dare to fight back. So, you know, and I think that is really significant from just a kind of observational point, because Western Australia is where this industry started. And I think, like, I wonder sometimes whether Western Australia will be the place where this ends. As to coherent policy platforms, again, I'm not in a position to articulate those or make those, because that is not my job. And if I do, I'll give you a wrong direction. But it's the group of people at ADN and others to kind of point you in those right directions. You know, what I will say is a good thriving media, you know, that is continuing to interrogate these ideas is critical to this, because you cannot hold power to account if you can't pay your rent. So that's my one clear policy proposal.
Yeah, and I think it always happy to put in a plug for accountable media, because if you know, one of the things I love to say about journalism is that is to quote another journalist whose name is Lara Satrakian. She talks about news as adult education, and if we want people to be engaged in our democracy, they need access to information, they need to be informed, and particularly in an issue like climate change, where there's been a lot of efforts to distract us or to uninform us. I think that's really important, and it's great to hear someone like Kath being engaged, newly engaged with this issue. On state capture, I guess you know, the work of the Australian Democracy Network is also, you know, looking at, it's not just the fossil fuel industry. There are other industries involved. I, for example, think, you know, it's perhaps worth mentioning military industrial complex or prison industrial complex and that sort of thing, because all of these things also do interact with climate change. So I know that sometimes it can feel overwhelming in terms of engaging. You know, people might choose one topic or one issue that they're interested in. But I think that when it comes to climate change, all of these things do interact, because as the climate changes and as the climate crisis worsens, do we really have time to be spending billions and trillions of dollars on weapons, and who is that for, and what might our democracy or what might our country look like if some of that money was redirected and invested back into more participatory programs, into, you know, reconnecting with nature and all of the incredible resources. I don't like to use that word, but you know, Australia is full of incredible natural resources beyond the fossil fuels, the dinosaur bones that have that have decayed underneath the ground that we've burned through very quickly and changed the landscape of this country in a very, very short period of time. So Andrew, we have another question there from Andrew. Can you come off mute to Andrew? Hello. We'll squeeze in one more question after this, hopefully, maybe one or two. So
Sounds like we may have lost Andrew.
okay, well, how about is Lena there? And I'll come back to Andrew if we get a chance. Otherwise, I'll read out Andrew's question. If you don't have to read out your question, I can always read it out for Andrew. Is Lena there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Lena.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you.
Welcome.
The webinar, and thanks, Royce, for your great work. I'm from Ghana country, South Australia, and although we are world champions on renewables, we have a very incestuous relationship with the gas industry. You're probably well aware of it. I'm really interested in what insights your research might offer us about how we can hold the South Australian government to account for their active support of the gas industry when 85% of the gas is being exported. Most of it's not being used in South Australia, and we're renewable champions.
And it's also worth mentioning as well that South Australia became a renewable champion due to a crisis. So, as you'll be well aware, but for those who aren't, there was the 2016 blackout, and the rest of the country kind of laughed at South Australia, and if there were federal politicians that were using South Australia as a to attack the state in its moment of crisis because it wanted to signal to coal communities that they had, we've got your back, coal's not going anywhere. So the success of South Australia was the product of crisis and a state being mobilized, and also a leadership that was alive to this and willing to do what it takes to increase that penetration of particularly PV solar. Now, in terms of what I see happening in South Australia, and you're right that during my research, I absolutely it was a fascinating experience. What became clear from listening from listening to people talk, listening to industry talk, is that the approach so far seems to be to allow governments to decarbonize up to a certain point and then rely on leadership, essentially cheaping out. So relying on governments to get 80% of the way there, 85, 90% of the way there, and then running the numbers and going, well, it's going to cost us a lot of money if you want to go 100% renewable energy. So maybe we just put some gas in the mix, and that will cover us. And I think that has been exacerbated in recent times by the reliance on carbon offsets or ACCUs, which is a whole other conversation, and it's a deliberately complicated system, but there is almost this sense or this idea that you can use accounting tricks and you can almost negotiate with physics by using accounting tricks to kind of work, like add and subtract and kind of work out a kind of net climate zero positive, which is not the case. What the scientists keep telling us, what the science says is that you need to cut fossil fuel consumption. You need to stop this carbon dioxide from going into the atmosphere where it stays up there for generations, and then you need to also cut demand and supply. This stuff needs to stay in the ground. Now, and you alluded to the situation in South Australia. There for a time you had the Premier, whose close brother worked for Santos in government relations. That was reported publicly. That's not a new insight. The Premier's brother was also formerly working as a staffer for the industry minister. How we break that in a place like South Australia, again, that requires another conversation, because South Australia is a very complicated place. You've lost a lot of its manufacturing base. It's looking around for solutions. Currently, Whyalla is in a lot of trouble over this plan to export hydrogen. And so the question for me is, I think it's more of a question going forward is, what happens at Whyalla? What happens with this hydrogen export plan? Has this been a misallocation of resources, and is it possible to push back in a political sense and get that and reallocate those resources to massively ramping up, like again, PV solar, wind farm, wind production, getting these things and batteries into kind of lower income households and really ramping this up to the scale where it needs to be and kind of get South Australia the rest of the way there, because there is a future to win, right? If South Australia can export kind of, green power to other states through its interconnectedness with the grid, I mean, that's a hugely good future. But it requires people to fight for it, to put pressure on politicians. For instance, I once saw, I can't remember which minister it was, but there was a minister who came to speak at a public event, and the very first question in line was, are you serious about climate change? What are you doing about this? The more these these decision makers and leadership get that question, and it's the first question, the more they're going to be inclined to do something about it.
Thank you.
And Lena, I guess, thinking about democracy and renewables, I think, Australia is a world leader in terms of solar panels on homes. And I think there is something almost democratic about that sort of redistribution of the power to create power back to homes. And it eliminates that extreme concentration of wealth, which is what actually has drawn some people to fossil fuels, and is part of the reason why they have sort of hung on for so long, is because there's nothing quite like sticking a drill in the ground and sucking up oil, because as much as they talk about creating jobs, it is one way to sort of generate quite a lot of wealth for a smaller amount of people. But in terms of sort of the democratic aspects of renewable energy, there's some interesting experiments going on. Maybe it means that people have like a little bit more money in their pockets if they are able to own their own home and build their own solar panels, that they might be able to invest in buying books or subscribing to quality journalism. But there's also experiments like this group. I don't know if you looked into them, Royce, but CoPower, which is a cooperative owned renewable energy organization, and one of the things they do is a couple of times a year is they vote together on how to spend their profits on sort of community projects. So they take the submissions for community projects and then decide how those profits will be allocated, just I guess to show like how maybe some of those projects might be related to access to information or media and that sort of thing, just to show that how a different approach could create a more sort of democratic approach.
Yeah.
I don't know if you looked at anything like that, but
well, and also just in terms of the change that flows on from that, right? So without going into detail, because it's a very dense discussion, but the more of those setups you can install, the more PV solar, more wind, the more those kind of decentralized systems. What you're actually watching is these systems white ant the business case for these big coal-fired power plants, these gas plants, even if it ever happens, nuclear plants. When you have a big when you have a big centralized power production facility, that the more solar, the more winds, the more decentralized networks you have, the more likely the price of that power is to go negative, and those facilities need to keep running or they need to shut down, and it costs a lot of money to start it back up again, a lot of time, and so it's becoming increasingly unprofitable for that centralized grid to operate, and that effect is only going to amp up over time. It is also why you're not going to get a nuclear power station anytime soon, because it's just complete nonsense. But but to go to some of the point that was being made is, this is, we're already seeing that change come through. We just need it to go faster.
Yeah, it's and like the power grid issues, that's only going to get worse with climate change. Thousands and thousands of kilometers worth of electricity wires that are affected by floods and fires, and yet if you put a solar panel on your house, or there are also projects that are bringing solar panels so that they can be used by emergency workers during during extreme fires. So yeah, there's lots of really great solutions that we're seeing as well. Maybe
Oh, and final thought, I know we have to wrap
Yeah,
up,
yeah.
but just
Fantastic, yeah.
one final thought as well. And an extension of this, I think, and this is something that came through during the research in the book, but is also very important to take away from tonight, is that it is very important to be able to imagine an alternative future and a better future, a future where you're able to generate your own power, you're paying less on your power bills, you have more money for fun and treats, and all those good things. You're not spending $2 at the pump every time you fill up the car. Being able to imagine that future is critical. And a lot of what's happened over the last two decades, if not longer, from from industry, when they put out books, particularly books for children, is that they never allow people to imagine a world without oil and gas. It is inconceivable. And a lot of this effort has gone into making sure that's the case. So if there's one thing to take away from tonight, it's the idea of being able to imagine a better world and then being able to work towards it.
Yeah, absolutely. So so I think that's, of course, like a perfect thought to finish on. Read books, read novels, engage with imagination, and also buy Slick. But Izab, I think you were going to share some closing thoughts with us. Thank you so much for speaking with me, Royce. It's been a pleasure. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank you to
Izab,
everyone.
have we got...
Yes, thank you so much, both of you. What an amazing chat that was. I just feel like I was the little head of all the emoji reactions in the background. Thank you so much, so much to think about. And thanks to everyone who shared really thoughtful questions as well. If you missed it, folks, we are really lucky to be able to offer ADN supporters a 20% discount off copies of Slick. It's a really excellent read. If it wasn't clear tonight, the combination of personal stories and deep research in the book is really compelling and moving. The link to buy it is in the chat right now. You can use the code ADN20 to get that discount. So it's all in capital letters, ADN20. I'll also chuck this in a follow-up email for you, but yeah, please buy the book. Lyndal and Royce, I really can't thank you enough for having this conversation with us tonight. I think it's really important to recognise, and you both spoke about it, but I want to back in that really crucial role that public interest and investigative journalism plays in a strong democracy. And without people like you and the work you're doing, we wouldn't have access to these stories. Politicians and other powerful people would be getting away with much more than they are, and generally would have less accountability for their actions. And as a public, we'd be less informed and have less power. And I think, yeah, a free press and a press that is independent from industry is such an indispensable part of a fair democracy. So thank you both for both of your work and for being here tonight. For those who are new to ADN, lots of questions about solutions and people power in the chat. I love to see it. So just to recap, we work on state capture and specifically on campaigns to get big money out of politics, expand civil society, and protect civil rights like the right to protest. We work in alliances with organizations and individuals because we have big systemic goals. We really think that we need to make significant changes to the laws that govern this country to make our democracy fairer, and making systemic changes takes collective work, takes all of us. So I'm really excited to work with you, and I'm excited to see that there's so many folks on the call who are excited about that kind of action. So thanks for being here and for your excellent engagement tonight. We'll be in touch. So you're on our mailing list now. Congratulations. We'll be in touch with opportunities to take action together. And we do call on solid solutions like overhauling our lobbying laws, getting donations transparency rules passed, winding back the increasing anti-protest laws across the country. We have an approach that's about reform. So yeah, there'll be lots of opportunities for you to take action together. And I think that's it. I'm really glad to be a part of this community with all of you, and excited to be having these conversations and to have an amazing book like Slick to be bringing us together and provoking some of these thoughts and providing, I guess, yeah, a real case study of the things that we know are happening and see playing out in our democracy. That's it, I think. Good night, folks. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.